you want me to pull out, I've got a copy of that. I can pull it out.
I got it somewhere. Here it is. I got it. It's my pleasure to recognize our second panel and welcome you and thank you for your patience and indulgence for being the second panel. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn before they testify, so I would ask you to please rise with me and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
May the record reflect all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I will introduce the witnesses from my left to right, your right to left. First is Dr. Natwar Gandhi, who is the Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. In the middle is Mr. Matt Fabian, who is the Managing Director of the Municipal Market Advisors. And last but not least is Dr. Alice Rivlin, who is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and was former Chair of the D.C. Control Board. I will recognize each of you in the order that I introduced you for a 5-minute opening statement. And again, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the subcommittee, Mr. Davis, Ms. Norton, Mr. Clay. I am, as you pointed out, Natwar M. Gandhi, Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia Government. I am pleased to be here for the subcommittee's hearing on Mayor Gray's proposed 2012 budget and financial plan. Mr. Chairman, in 1995, the U.S. Congress created the Office of the Independent Chief Financial Officer to work with the Mayor and the Council to maintain the district's fiscal stability and enhance its financial viability. Since then, we have completed 14 consecutively balanced budgets and expect to end the current year in the same manner. Between 1996 and 2008, we turned a cumulative $550 million deficit into an impressive $1.2 billion fund balance. Further, we transformed a nearly bankrupt district government plagued with junk bond ratings into a financially credible jurisdiction with strong credit ratings. Indeed, our turnaround from junk bonds to status A category bond ratings was faster than any other major city that has undergone similar period of financial crisis, including New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Detroit. Attachment 1 to my testimony and the board before you on my left tells the story of the district's successful return to fiscal solvency and financial stability. This turnaround is a case study in commitment to improve financial management and practices. Our general obligation bond ratings have increased at an unprecedented speed. They now stand at A+ from Standard & Poor's and are in the AA category from Moody's Investor Services and Fitch Ratings. In addition, our income tax rated revenue bonds are rated AAA by Standard & Poor's. This is indeed a record of which the district can be justifiably proud. As in case of many jurisdictions around the country, the recession of the past several years had taken a toll on our finances. Our general fund balance has dropped from a peak of $1.6 billion in 2005 to $890 million at the close of 2010, a decrease of some $695 million over 5 fiscal years. In early February, the newly elected leadership and I visited the 3 rating agencies to discuss the results and lay out a plan for the future. I'm pleased to report that Mayor's 2012 budget and financial plan meets the rating agency's expectation despite the difficulties experienced due to loss of about a quarter of previously projected 2012 revenues and the expiration of the federal stimulus fund, a loss of some $228 million compared to the previous fiscal year. The Mayor's proposed budget meets all the criteria required for certification by the Chief Financial Officer. And they are, this proposed budget is balanced, It does not use any fund balance. That is, it requires the district to live within its means. It is in compliance with our Debt Cap Act, which limits the debt service on our tax-supported debt to 12% of expenditures. Mr. Chairman, I would like to take the issue with those who proclaim that the district's finances are failing to the point that a reinstatement of a control board is imminent. Yes, the district is facing challenges, but none of these 7 control board triggers will be breached. Congress, in its wisdom, created the Office of Chief Financial Officer for the purpose of preventing any of those triggers. Our elected leadership pledged to the rating agency and to the district residents that they will do what is necessary to balance the budget without the use of fund balance and limit borrowing to stay within the debt cap. Our challenges, however, are significant. The district, as the urban center of a large metropolitan area, the houses a disproportionately large share of very poor and needy citizens. District's overall poverty rate of 17% and the child poverty rate of 26% are among the highest in the nation and more than 3 times the comparable rate across the neighboring counties. Unlike other jurisdictions that provide services to a large share of regions poor, the districts cannot divert resources from wealthier suburban areas to serve its urban poor. In this environment, the continuing expenditure needs, the challenges posed by the reduced revenues is substantial. Kindly permit me to briefly note 2 areas that merit continuous attention. Both go to the unfunded mandates that restrict the district's own taxing power. The prohibition on taxing the income earned by non-residents, including those who commute into the city on a daily basis, that 66% of income generated in the district is earned by non-residents and makes the simple point. The district also has an especially high concentration of non-taxable real property, much of it of the tax rose due to presence of the federal establishment. The value of the property held by the federal government alone is 30% of the non-residential property values. Mr. Chairman, I will not belabor on the issue of the district's budget autonomy. Mayor and the chairman spoke so eloquently about that, but I emphasize my endorsement of their views. I want to thank you for your leadership, sir, and appreciate your visiting Wilson Building, indeed our offices, and appreciate your interest very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi. It was a pleasure to meet with you. Mr. Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin to speak about the District of Columbia, I just want to emphasize that Municipal Market Advisors, my firm, is a pure independent research company. So we make no money on trading, underwriting, investing in municipal bonds. We provide pure research and sell that research for subscriptions, and that makes up about 95% of our revenues. Normally, when we do an awful lot of commentary about the municipal bond, and I have my statement which I'm submitted, but I'll speak off that, I think, just to keep things time efficient. Normally, our company talks a lot about the municipal bond market in general, and we have spent a disproportionate amount of time in recent 2 years looking at distressed credits, Jefferson County, Harrisburg, Vallejo, California. So it's a real pleasure to spend some time and look at the District of Columbia, which has done so well in the financial crisis, managing largely through the practices from their management team like Dr. Gandhi. I have to say that as things have gotten tighter, as credit conditions and tax revenues have gotten thinner across the country, the financial abilities of city managers across the country has been strained, and it has begun to undermine willingness in some cases to honor obligations. That is completely the opposite of the case in the district. We have seen very strong management responses, and if anything, an increasing willingness towards bondholders and toward servicing their obligations. So, just with that as sort of the opening context, there's two, and I have an awful lot of information in my statement about the structure of the bonds and investor perception of the bonds. But let me say that there's two particular successes, I'd say, from that management has had over the past few years. First is the imposition of the more conservative debt cap to 12% of annual spending. Yes. and that has been from widely recognized by the rating agencies as a credit strength, and from looking at the future economic prospects of the district and the country, things will continue to be very difficult. The financial crisis for the states and for cities and for governments like the district is transitioning from a revenue problem into a spending problem. So proactive limits on debt and leverage are very well received in the municipal bond market today. In addition, their restructuring of their variable rate debt over the last few years. Variable rate debt is long maturity bonds where the coupon resets every week or every day. Mostly these are packaged with derivatives. Prior to the financial crisis, the district had about 22% of its debt in these kinds of instruments. Very difficult because that is the exact kind of instrument which came under pressure in the financial crisis. The district was able to use its new income tax bond structure, and because of its very high ratings, was able to restructure a huge amount of that debt, and now its exposure to variable rate is a very manageable 9%. So I have to say that they have been very proactive in hitting the exact area where the municipal bond market was weakest in their response. Looking forward, I do say that, like I said before, the financial crisis is not necessarily abating for cities and states. The National Governors Association has talked about a lost decade for state revenues starting last year. So 2010 to 2020 are going to be a very difficult time for government managers everywhere. So I think continuing to prepare for the fiscal crisis is exactly what the district has done. The improvements, the situation that has come up in the earlier panel talking about budget autonomy is very well, it's an important one for the municipal bond market. If you think about what happened just prior to the government shutdown, the district, because of how the debt is structured, is able to service most of its debt even without congressional authorization and without the city budget appropriation, except for the city certificates of participation. So there's a $240 million bonded obligation that the district has, which they under the law would not have been able to pay had the federal government shut down. So there could now the city managers were doing all that they could to make sure that that didn't happen, but they were taking emergency steps to do so. In theory, they may not have been able to pay those interest payments, which is something that even in the depth of the financial crisis, the district did not miss a payment. So in this current municipal bond market where there is an enormous amount of concern being put on credit quality of state and local issuers, to have the district even incidentally miss a debt service payment because of the actions of Congress, would have had a real impact on the debt service cost of the district going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fabian. Dr. Rivlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify today. I've been involved with the district's finances for a long time, for more than 2 decades. Over that period, our nation's capital has gone from a financial basket case to a responsibly managed and fiscally healthy city. In my brief remarks, I will try to put the district situation in some historical context. This year, Washington, like most cities, is dealing with difficult budget choices. The deep recession and the extraordinary weakness of the housing market have cut city revenues, especially property tax revenues. And at the same time, the increased needs of the jobless and homeless residents have put upward pressure on spending. This combination has made balancing the budget far more challenging in the last 3 years than earlier in the decade when things were going better. That's true of all cities. The impact of the recession on D.C.'s finances has been considerably less serious than in many cities that were hit harder by the recession and the foreclosure crisis. Compared to other cities, the D.C. economy is actually doing quite well. Jobs are up, population is growing, economic development is resuming, and city revenues are beginning to edge up again. However, as the Mayor and the Council Chair have emphasized, Washington is a bifurcated city with prosperous areas and primarily on the western side of the city, and high rates of poverty, unemployment, and underemployment primarily on the eastern side. So efforts to mitigate these problems make the D.C. budget challenging. District must provide both city and state-like services, and it has a narrow tax base, mainly because Congress prohibits the district from taxing the incomes earned in the city by non-residents. Mayor Gray has proposed a combination of spending cuts and revenue increases designed to close a budget gap that was estimated at $322 million. This is a rather small shortfall in a $9.6 billion budget, of which $6.3 billion are locally raised funds. There will be a debate about this budget in the Council, but I am confident that the final budget will be balanced in a fiscally responsible way. The main reason for my confidence is that the city has a strong record of fiscal responsibility stretching back to the end of the 1990s. More importantly, the Mayor, the Council, and the Chief Financial Officer are all committed to maintaining that record and avoiding any danger of the triggering of a new control period. I was personally involved in that unfortunate period of D.C. fiscal history and share the view that it must not happen again. In early 1995, the district was facing imminent bankruptcy. It was a really bad situation. The Federal Government had to step in and do what a State normally does, put in place a control board. I was President Clinton's point person on doing that, and I worked closely with Delegate Norton, with Congressman Chair Tom Davis of the Congress, with Speaker Newt Gingrich and the leadership of the Senate. It was a thoroughly bipartisan effort. It had to be. And it resulted in the creation of the Control Board and the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. We wound up the Control Board successfully in 2001. The district residents and officials have taken the lessons of that difficult period to heart. For more than a dozen years, as has been emphasized before, the district has been a model of fiscal responsibility, has continued to balance its budget, built up its fund balance and cash reserves, and improved its credit rating remarkably. In the last several years, as the recession reduced revenues, the district has drawn down its fund balance. That's what reserves are for, but not to dangerous levels, and it is now in a position to begin replenishing those reserves. It is now past time, I believe, for the Congress to recognize the district's exemplary fiscal behavior and pass legislation giving the district fiscal autonomy, the ability to spend its locally raised revenues as its elected government sees fit. This would represent your faith in representative democracy, that it works. I've testified before on this subject, and I attach my testimony of November 2009 for the record. In short, Mr. Chairman, I believe that the District of Columbia has a manageable fiscal challenge this year and can be counted on to balance its budget in a sustainable and responsible manner. And I also believe that the Congress should demonstrate its faith in representative democracy by granting the district fiscal autonomy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Rivlin. Dr. Gandhi, can you take maybe a minute or so and update us on the hospital in the district?
Yes, sir. As you know, we took over the hospital in July of last year, primarily to make sure that the satisfactory health care services are provided east of the river, where there is a large needy population. And we wanted to make sure that there is no interruption of healthcare services. So at that time, we took over the hospital. Like any public health hospital, not-for-profit public health hospital, this hospital also has its challenges. In addition, it had a troubled history, and it has substantial issues that we need to resolve. At the end of the day, district would have to be quite mindful, given our experience earlier with DC General Hospital some 10 years ago. When we went to Wall Street, there was substantial concern about our owning the hospital again. Mayor and the chairman and the leadership at the council and in the mayor's office, they're all quite concerned about the viability of the hospital. We want to make sure that we provide healthcare services east of the river, but at the same time, we do not want to be in the hospital business. My expectation is that the mayor and the council would resolve the issue satisfactorily.
Dr. Gandhi, the district has a problem that other cities have, although the district problem may be more exacerbated, which is tax exempt properties, properties where you have to provide the service, but you can't collect any taxes. Do you have a strategy? Do you have a plan? Is there a means by which you can adjust for that, the fact that you're providing services to buildings and places where you can argue there's not a contribution towards the greater good?
That is one of the two major issues that we presently face in managing our so-called constrained, limited, restricted tax base. One is, of course, the inability to tax people who work here and don't live here. And second is, as I pointed out in my testimony, a large chunk of our real property is tax exempt. As I pointed out, the federal government, the tax exempt institutions, the World Bank, IMF, embassies, etc. I used to have an office on the 11th floor of the Judiciary Square building. Outside, I looked, beautiful museums, monuments, galleries, nothing I could tax. That is a major problem for the city. It is a limited tax base. Other cities, like Hartford, Cambridge, Philadelphia, they do have a pilot payment, payment in lieu of taxes. I'm not so sure that that is going to work here. But I think the federal government needs to take into account the fundamental limitation of our tax base. In spite of all this, our commitment to you, sir, and certainly of the independent chief financial officers, despite these limitations on our taxes, we will balance the budget. We will maintain our financial viability and financial credibility on Wall Street.
Dr. Gandhi, I've got about a minute left, so I'll ask the question quickly, and then you can have the remainder of the time. Long-term pension liabilities in the city, what's the status? Any reason for concern?
Well, I think in general we manage our liabilities very well. We do not have the major concern of the rest of the jurisdiction around the country of the pension liabilities. We do not have that. Federal government took over a bulk of our liability on that front. All our long-term liabilities, and particularly the pension liabilities, are actuarially funded, fully funded, actuarially speaking. So we are very blessed, and I would give great credit to our elected leadership, Mayor and the Council, for abiding by that requirement.
Thank you. I would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, given the fact that Representative Clay has a markup that he's involved in, I would ask that I switch time with him and let him go, and then I'll take his order.
Without objection.
Thank you. Let me thank the gentleman from Illinois and thank the chairman for conducting this hearing. A question for all three witnesses. How would you characterize the district's fiscal health in relation to other large cities? And starting with you, Dr. Gandhi.
Thank you, sir. I'm pleased to say that, relatively speaking, Washington, D.C. is in better financial condition than perhaps any other major cities out there. We have still $343 million of so-called rainy day fund. We make sure that our budget is always balanced. We have a very independent and vigorous office of independent chief financial officer that tracks our budget almost on a weekly basis. So when you look at all these considerations, we are in a very good financial condition, and that is not just me saying it. Wall Street says that. They reaffirmed our AAA bond rating on income tax bonds, A+ category bonds ratings on our GO bonds with a stable outlook. That is more than what can be said about many other jurisdictions around the country.
Mr. Fabian.
Well, I would agree also with Dr. Gandhi. I think that the location of the Federal Government has been a tremendous economic stabilizer for the city, in addition to its management practices. Looking forward, one of the things that cities and states around the country have been very loath to do is to raise taxes to help balance their budgets. The district is at least considering this, and I think that, from a Wall Street perspective, having a city or a jurisdiction that is willing to look at all financial options to correct its structural budget gap is a real positive.
Thank you. Dr. Rivlin.
I agree with Dr. Gandhi and Mr. Fabian. We're in relatively good shape, and we're very lucky. I have sometimes said to the mayor when he was sounding down about the fiscal situation, cheer up, you could be mayor of Detroit. The situation in cities that were in trouble anyway because they were losing their manufacturing base is much worse than it is here. And we are lucky that our major industry is the Federal Government and the activities that it attracts, and those are in pretty good shape.
Thank you all for your response. And Mr. Chairman, as well as Chairman Issa, not to engage in a debate over the merits of the bill at this time, but as a question, could this committee seriously, or the full committee, take a serious look at Representative Norton's bill that gives the city control over its own tax dollars? I think that with the testimony that we've heard today, the city has certainly demonstrated their ability to in a fiscally prudent way, manage their resources. Perhaps it is time that we actually take a look at giving the city more responsibility. We are guests here, and I just would like to hear.
If the gentleman would yield.
Chair, yes.
I have looked at the gentlelady's draft legislation earlier on, and now I'm reasonably confident that, no, we cannot accept budget autonomy fully, but I am going to be offering an alternative that I hope the gentlelady will join with me on that provides a mechanism for a separate vote and separate consideration of the district's funds. And that's what I was alluding to in my question with the mayor. And what I hope to be able to work with Delegate Norton on is an ability to have an early on annual vote to accept the budget, what I would call a contingent budget, the budget of exclusive jurisdiction of the district, meaning what they do with their money as it shall come in. I think that we would be hubris for us to assume that we could do anything about the appropriation process of other funds. But I think by bifurcating them, we can, in fact, come up with something that accomplishes what Ms. Norton is asking for. We can do it early on in every Congress and do it separate from the sometimes difficult budget process.
Yeah, and I thank you for your response. I would have to take a look at your proposal in more detail because
I'm looking for co-sponsors when I drop it.
Well, so. but really, I still think that we are treating this locale as a stepchild, and it's probably time we loosen the strings that we have applied to them since the 1990s and move forward. I mean, they have certainly shown fiscal responsibility. And I know my time is up, but I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Missouri. At this time, I would recognize Chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence as all of us go back and forth the judiciary today. Dr. Gandhi, earlier on when I asked the Mayor about contingent budget proposals, I knew I was asking the wrong person, but he was the right person to be asked first. When you look at the finances of the city, as a Federal city, with all of the responsibilities, certainly we've met with your police chief many times, and she has a responsibility like no other big city police chief, because protests come here, other activities come here, which she must deal with first, even though she has backup of Federal agents. Do you believe that the district could produce an annual contingent budget? Now, let's assume for a moment that we were a 3/4, 1/4 ratio of all Federal funding to the district's self-funding for a moment. Do you believe you could produce a full funding document that would say, we have a contingent capability for, let's say, 10 months, meaning that if we receive substantially less, we can continue operating. If we receive nothing, we can operate for 10 months. And, of course, if it looks like for some reason there's no money coming, you would adjust. But do you believe you could produce that contingency that would take us, let's just say, from this month to the end of the year on an annual basis?
Yes, sir. And I say that quite advisedly, because the Federal contribution to the district, that is distinctly for the district, is less than 2% of its budget. We get about $174 million if everything that Mayor is asking for 2012, or the President is asking for, is $174 million in a $10 billion budget. What the budget autonomy that I'm endorsing here is that let us spend our local dollars. And obviously the $174 million that I'm talking about must be appropriated by the Congress in its usual regulatory and legislative way, and that's fine with us. All we are suggesting here is that when we pass our own budget, as we will in June, that we should be allowed to spend money. And second, if you give us budget autonomy, then we would like to realign our budget with our specific needs. October, September, the time frame doesn't work for local government. The next thing I would say is that dependent upon the Federal government.
What date would work for you, Doctor?
They work for any other local jurisdiction, which is June, July.
So, echoing what you're saying, if we considered a D.C. money only, and by the way, that would include, for example, a school lunch program that you expect to have Federal money for not getting it. So I want to make sure that when we talk about no Federal dollars, that you would maintain all that you believe you need. If that were the case and we were to deliver, you were to deliver us a budget by, let's say, March, we were to forward it through the Congress and have it passed before July as a freestanding, separate from appropriations, that would meet your needs very well, recognizing that the dollars that would come from the Federal government would come on a different schedule.
Yeah, I understand that. And again, to repeat myself, all we want is to make sure that we're allowed to spend our local dollars according to our own wishes and according to our own timetable.
Any other comments on the idea of bifurcating the two?
I think that it would be a real credit strength from Wall Street's perspective. I mean, still having that level of Federal oversight to make sure that the district keeps its game clean, but otherwise, absolutely.
Well, and you said something, and I want to be careful. I don't want to accept game clean, but the view, at least from this side of the dais, for myself, has been that the district, although it has done a very good job in recent years, lacks an equivalent. Los Angeles does a good job, but ultimately Sacramento has a major role in education and so many other areas. The view is we don't have as major a role, but we have a role, and I think that's what you were saying.
Yes, exactly, absolutely.
Doctor?
Yes, I think this would be possible and that it's a very good idea. And the Congress would not be relinquishing its ultimate oversight responsibility and the provisions that in extremis would bring back a control board.
Well, it is the goal of this committee to have sufficient oversight and have sufficient good conduct that we'll never go back to the days in which you had hands in every aspect of it far beyond this committee. I thank the Chairman and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Issa. The Chair would now recognize the distinguished gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
The ranking member is taking Mr. Clay's place, so I understand. Chairman Issa's proposal is something I want very much, because it's the first I've heard of it, but it's one I certainly very much would like to work with him on and to build on. Indeed, during the shutdown, I had a number of bills just to keep us open for the rest of the year, but then I had one bill that said in the event of a shutdown, in any year, the district may spend its local funds so that we would not have to go through what you went through this time. What you say on schools, and I'd like any of or all of you to speak about that, the